With the relevant parameters being received, WellSeeker Pro has the ability to utilise the WITS data from the rig to automatically populate the slide sheet. This is achieved via the rig states dialog, where the individual data streams are processed together to determine if the assembly is drilling ahead in rotary or sliding. User-definable thresholds help to guide the software when determining the relevant rig states. An example of how the rig states logics works is as follows. Is the bit on bottom? This is determined if the hole depth minus the bit depth is less than the on-bottom data threshold. If on bottom, are you drilling? This is determined if the pump pressure, flow rate, weight on bit and hook load are all above their respective thresholds. If any one of these is below the threshold, then the rig states does not consider the operation as drilling. If drilling is registered, the final thing that is determined is if you're sliding or rotating, and this is defined when the RPM value is greater than the RPM threshold. In addition to the thresholds, the RPM buffer section gives the user some control over the RPM values used by the rig states. This is important because the RPM values usually update fairly quickly and can sometimes vary by a significant amount. The buffer helps to smooth this, stopping the rig states changing every time a spurious value is read. The buffer size determines how many RPM values are remembered in the RPM buffer box. These values are constantly updating and always show the most recent RPM value received. 9 is a good value to use here, as this is how many values show on the screen without having to scroll, and it also covers a time period of around a minute, assuming new values are received every 5 to 6 seconds. The RPM buffer threshold is important, as this is used by the rig states as a guide regarding how to process the RPM values received. With a buffer threshold of 3, rig states will only register rotation if less than 3 of the values in the box are below the threshold. If any more than 3 of the RPM values are below the threshold, then the rig states will not register the rotation and will present as sliding. 3 is usually a good value to use here, but the user may need to play with this value depending on the situation. One common scenario is where the pipe is being oscillated during the slide at an RPM that is the same or greater than is being used for rotary drilling. In this scenario, the rig states can sometimes mislabel the slide as a rotate. One way to deal with this is to reduce the RPM buffer threshold to 1 or 2. This adjustment will mean that the rig states will only register rotation if most of the measured values are above the threshold, which is less likely to be the case while oscillating. On the screen we have 2 examples. In both we are sliding while oscillating the pipe at 100 RPM. Note the RPM threshold is set at 50. The only difference between the 2 examples is the RPM buffer threshold. One is set at 5 and is showing the rig states switching between sliding and rotating, while the other has the RPM buffer threshold set at 2 and is showing a solid sliding rig state. So in a situation where the user is oscillating the pipe while sliding and the rig states is reading rotating or constantly switching between sliding and rotating, lower the RPM buffer threshold and this should help to address the issue.